So first, I want to really thank Venerable Chodron for her teachings on the Precious Garland and for giving me this opportunity to look at this work through the lens of current events. And this is my first BBC, so I apologize if I screw up. There has been some discussion, both here at the Abbey recently and online, regarding socially engaged Buddhism. The question is, should Buddhist monastics and practitioners in general actively advocate for governmental policies based on equality, justice, peace, compassion, and care for the environment? I think this question was answered back in the 2nd century by Nagarjuna, a Buddhist monk and philosopher who lived between 150 and 250 AD. On his text, The Precious Garland of Advice for a King, Nagarjuna not only instructs the king on very profound philosophical points, but also provides advice on how to rule the kingdom in accordance with the Dharma. In other words, Nagarjuna advocates. He advocates for governmental policies based on Dharma principles. He tells the king, on verses 126 and 125, devote yourself to the Dharma of generosity, ethical conduct, and fortitude. King, if you undertake deeds that begin with the Dharma, have the Dharma in the middle and Dharma at the end, you will not be harmed in this world or the next. So, in order to understand Nagarjuna's approach to advocacy, I wanted to look at not just what he did, but also how he did it. I think that was very important. I wanted to understand his motivation, and I wanted to discern how he spoke to the king, meaning what tone he used, what words he used, and in what context. And also I wanted to understand the actual content of his advice. So what did he focus on? What were the important points? To explain his motivation, Nagarjuna tells the king the following, and I'm talking about verses 301 to 303. If the king acts in a way that contradicts the Dharma or does something that doesn't make sense, most of his subjects will still praise him, right? Because people would be afraid to tell the king that what he's doing doesn't make sense. People will be afraid of doing that. Nagarjuna says, if it is even difficult to say something beneficial but unpleasant to others, meaning regular people, how can I, a monk, hope to do so to a king of a large realm? So, that's a fair question. And he proceeds to give an answer, and this is the crux of his motivation. Nagarjuna says, but because of my affection for you, he cared for the king, and also due to my compassion for all beings, I myself will tell you what is quite helpful but not very pleasant. So that is a beautiful way of really setting out very clearly what his motivation was. He really cared for the king, and he wanted the king to govern well, to do a good job for himself and for his citizens. And he wanted to benefit everyone. But he went further with his advice to the king. He said to him, realizing that what I tell you is helpful in this context and others, meaning in governing, implement it for your own sake and also for the sake of the world. So he didn't want the king to just have a narrow view. He wanted to really think about it more broadly, look at interests in terms of what would benefit the whole world and not just his own narrow interest. So similarly, when we engage in advocacy, we should follow, I think, Nagarjuna's example and do it with a motivation to benefit all involved, including policymakers and those who think differently from us. Nagarjuna's words to the king were spoken in a friendly tone, conveying respect and concern for the king's well-being, as well as a deep understanding of the king's roles and responsibilities. So he knew what the king needed to do, and he wanted to help him do that. And he didn't shy away from difficult topics. Again, this is an example for us in that our advocacy efforts should be free from animosity or divisiveness, and instead focus on building common ground and understanding among different groups of people. Nagarjuna's advice is clear, concise, direct, and touches upon the king's most important spheres of influence. Regarding policymaking, he said, "A useless political theory is one that intends to deceive others." I mean, that's very clear. How could one intent on deceiving others be a true statesman at all? I mean, this is how highly he regarded honesty and truthfulness. In terms of social policy, Nagarjuna advised the king to invest in education and pay educators well, to take care of vulnerable populations such as the elderly, the very young, and the ill, to pay doctors out of his own pocket, using money from the king's own states to ensure that those suffering had access to medical care. And he suggested the king focus on enhancing the kingdom's infrastructure and asked him to show compassion for the homeless, the poor, the ill, and the downtrodden. And I'm going to read some of the verses that really highlight these points because I think they're so beautiful and rich. So for the sake of increasing wisdom, provide for the livelihood of the schoolmasters in all of the educational institutions of the land, and formally grant states to them. So not just pay them, but really endow them and support them to do the teaching. With the proceeds from your fields, this is from your own revenues, establish wages for doctors and barbers for the sake of the elderly, the young, and the ill, so as to relieve the suffering. So really provide medical care. You of good wisdom, establish rest houses and build parks and causeways, pools, pavilions, and cisterns. Provide for bedding, grasses, and wood. So really, provide for the comfort and well-being of the subjects. Out of compassion, always care for the ill, the homeless, those afflicted by suffering, the downtrodden and unfortunate, and respectfully, I mean, this is a key word I think here, respectfully, apply yourself to aiding them. By way of foreign policy, Nagarjuna advises the king to care for refugees and offer assistance to countries hit by famine and disease. And so he says, always care extensively for places in the world that are oppressed or where crops have failed, that have suffered harm, or where there is plague, or that have been conquered in war. This is verse 251. So there's a very vast scope here in terms of international involvement that he was advising for the king in a very antithetical way to waging wars. So he was really concerned about the global well-being. In regards to the justice system, and this is again very enlightening, he asked the king to be compassionate with prisoners and to provide them with food, drink, and medical care, as well as clothing. There are several verses on it, 331, 332, and 335. And here is the one that I think really embodies the spirit of this advice. It says, until they are released, those prisoners should be made content by providing them with barbers, baths, food, drink, clothing, and medical care. Nagarjuna asks the king to extend his kindness and care to travelers who are tired, thirsty, and hungry. And I think that one could argue that there is a contemporary parallel in terms of showing kindness to immigrants who are very much like travelers coming from far away, hungry, thirsty, and tired. He says, at the sites of cisterns, which is where on roads where they had offer water for travelers, place shoes, parasols, and water filters, tweezers for removing thorns, needles, thread, and fans. So again, provide for their comfort. Also in those places, provide fruit, 3 kinds of salt, honey, eye medicine, and antidotes to poison. So provide for their health as well. Place ointments for the body, feet, and the head, cradles, ladles, and ewers, brass pots, axes, and so on. So again, be generous with travelers. Be generous with people who are weary and tired from their journeys. There's also advice on how to care for animals and insects. Again, not just be concerned about human beings, but broaden your scope of interest and activity to care for all. Nagarjuna encourages the king to appoint ministers who value ethical conduct and uphold high standards of behavior. And he says on verse 323, appoint as ministers policy experts who are pious, polite, and pure, devoted, courageous, of good family, ethically outstanding, and grateful. Appoint military advisors that are generous and attached, heroic and polite, who properly use resources, are steadfast and always vigilant and pious. So to conclude, Nagarjuna provides an example of how to approach advocacy from a Buddhist point of view by having a proper motivation, avoiding animosity and divisiveness, and advocating for issues related to the well-being of vulnerable populations, whether they be domestic or foreign. And I think verse 342 summarizes Nagarjuna's intent very well. He says, from reigning properly in this way, your kingdom will not be chaotic. It will not proceed improperly nor contradict the Dharma. It will be in harmony with the Dharma. Thank you.
I can't. It's on. I can't remember how. I can't remember. Didn't Nagarjuna say about prison sentences that they shouldn't be so long?
Actually, this is what he said. I was trying to shorten the.
Yeah, for me that's kind of a.
But yes, there is one that's very particular. Actually, there's a couple that I pulled out. 331 says, King, out of compassion, you should always make your mind focused upon benefiting all beings, even those that have committed the most serious misdeeds. You should particularly have compassion for those that have committed the serious negativity of murder. Those who have ruined themselves are indeed worthy of great person's compassion. Then right below this verse, there's a couple of verses about make sure that you keep the prison sentence short, that you release them, that you have regular releases of prisoners so that you're not, keeping these people forever in jail. His attitude is definitely very, very generous and compassionate towards those who have committed some wrongdoing. And he says to the king here, those who have ruined themselves, meaning the prisoners and are indeed worthy of a great person's compassion.
Yeah, what made me think of this is I had a conversation with a nurse who's from some country in Africa. He works in the U.S. And he was always surprised by how long our sentences were. They weren't so long in his country, and his thoughts made a lot of sense to me, and so do these.
Yeah, so Nagarjuna did say that.